I became very interested in the cognitive science of religion, in part because, as an atheist, I look at religious people and I often scratch my head and think, but why? Why do you believe that? It's such ludicrous nonsense. And so it would be handy if I could provide some kind of an explanation by appealing to cognitive science for what seems to me to be such an irrational belief. But of course, my religious opponent, in many cases, will be scratching his or her head and having just exactly the same kind of thought about why can't I see that the religion is true? Very often they'll insist that really I can see that the religion is true and I'm really in some sort of state of denial or something like that. And so I was wondering to what extent your research might provide some ammunition to the religious believer in terms of giving an account of why it is that atheists irrationally reject belief in God. Is there any prospect of them using your research in that kind of way? Would you endorse that kind of use?
Yeah. Well, thanks, that's a great question. I guess my own view would be that reasons are different from causes, right? So whenever we're talking with folks, we normally want to know the reasons why you believe things, and we're looking for an argument in response. So for the theist saying, how could you believe that? What they're asking for is an argument from you about why that's a reasonable position to hold, and you're doing the same with them. The cognitive science view is focusing on cause, and it's making the controversial claim that reasons are not always causes. So the fact that you make up, not that you make up an argument, but you accept an argument and you hold an argument, a rational viewpoint of why you believe something, that might not actually be the causal reason why you hold that belief in the first place. You know, there could be all these different biases that are leading you to finding that idea compelling, right? Now, in terms of, is there space for people either of the atheist persuasion or the religious persuasion to use these types of findings to further their own ends? The clear answer is yes, for both sides, because people are. And there are these big debate conferences over, you know, what does the cognitive science of religion mean for theology? So I found out this firsthand where I wrote a piece for the New Scientist summarizing some of this research and titled it, Why Would You Believe or Not Believe? You know, some basic title. Now the editors got a hold of this and titled it, whenever it went online, Religion is Irrational, but So is Atheism. Well, I didn't say that. I wasn't saying that atheism is an irrational position to hold. I was saying that there are all these irrational biases at work that could lead us in the direction of atheism or not atheism. And so I, of course, got savaged online for being a Templeton apologist or being a religious apologist or something for that, when that's not what I was arguing. So for atheists, they want to say cognitive science of religion shows what's going on in the mind, what's going on in the brain that can explain those beliefs. So therefore, it's not God putting those beliefs in your head, it's evolution and your social environment. And the religious people are saying, just because we know how something comes along doesn't mean that it's not true. And they're wanting to say that, that maybe that's God's handiwork in the world that makes all human beings, maybe he's touched evolution in some way to give us these ideas.
Yeah. Can I just make one, sorry to dominate, but just one. So, I mean, the thing about the HADD, the hyperactive agency detecting device, is that if it's in here, it's going to cause me to have beliefs in invisible agents, and it's going to do that whether or not there are any invisible agents. So it's not a truth-sensitive mechanism particularly. It's going to produce a lot of false positives. Whereas the mechanism that you're looking at, so far as atheism is concerned, it didn't see, I mean, clearly you can see that it's going to have a causal impact, but it didn't appear to me to be necessarily an irrational causal impact, a non-truth sensitive causal mechanism. It seems to me that very often, well, if you ask atheists why they believe what they believe, they will point to the reasons. If you ask a religious person, very often they'll point to other religious people, and they get a great deal of reassurance from the thought that these very intelligent, well-informed people believe it too. And then if the creds issue comes up and it turns out these people are not walking the walk, then they will quite rightly reduce the overall credibility of their religious belief as a response. It is not an irrational response. You can causally, you can see the mechanism in play, but that doesn't mean it's not a rational response. Is that right, do you think?
Yes, well, that's using rationality, I think, in a different way, from taking it from sort of norm, ideal-based rationality to doing the best job at making decisions in tough environments. So the CREDS device, the reason why it's there, if the evolutionary story is correct, is to prevent you from being deceived constantly and using all of your actions to benefit other people and not yourself. So there's a reason why it's there, and there's a causal history there. So it's rational in the sense of evolution by natural selection. It makes sense to have that bias, or it did for our species. But that doesn't mean that it fits the sort of ideal normative rationality type that we think of as, you know, non-contradiction and reasoning according to statistical, you know, analyses of what's more probable. So it's just, I think it's a different use of the term rational. But otherwise, that makes sense to me, what you're saying.
Okay. Sorry. The audience, gentlemen over there.
If you're neither atheist nor religious, where does that leave you?
Oh, is this for me? Oh, okay. Yeah, so that would depend, I guess, on your definition of religion, which is a whole other contentious issue. Do we want to align religion with belief in supernatural agents? And then if we define atheism as lack of belief in supernatural agents, then I think that's a contradiction. You can't be both. But some people use the word religious to describe, you know, a sense of the numinous, or a social gathering of people that, you know, is coalitional, and they believe in certain moral truths and a way to better the world. And if you want to use religion in that sense, then you could be both atheistic and religious. But yeah, if you keep it to supernatural agents, I think those two contradict. So you could only be one or the other. That's why I kind of use the term non-theism in that sense, to where non-theism would also include agnosticism, or people that self-identify as agnostics, where they do not possess a belief in the existence of supernatural agents. So they're non-theistic, even though they might, as a label for themselves, not like the label atheist.
Like most lectures I attend, I find that I know less at the end than I knew at the beginning. And my doubt today is, what is my rationality and what is not? I did understand, you know, about 5% was my conscious and about 95% wasn't. If you're trying to be a rational being, how can you approach your subconscious? I don't know which one of this panel this question would apply to.
I think we should give this to Chris.
Well, I think we've heard some good examples there in John's talk. There are ways of distinguishing between the kind of explicitly expressed views and beliefs that people say they hold, and maybe actually do hold, but also you can show with certain other kinds of testing that at an unconscious level, there may be kind of contradictions there may be biases there that we're just not aware of. I mean, that particular view of the human mind, I mean, the Daniel Kahneman type approach, that we've got these two different systems, is now, I think it's very generally, very widely accepted within psychology that that's a pretty accurate picture of the way our minds work. So on the one hand, you have this so-called system one thinking that's intuitive, emotion-driven, you're not consciously aware of it, it's very quick, it's quick and dirty, it's heuristics. In contrast to that, there's system two, that's the more reflective mode of thought that you are consciously aware of, it's effortful, etc., etc. And whereas most of us like to think that we base our opinions on system two, there's an awful lot of evidence that shows that actually that we're very often influenced far more than we realise by system one. What we're very good at is then rationalising those views. I mean, I'm just getting back to the issue that Stephen raised. I mean, Michael Shermer's written a book called Why Do People Believe Weird Things? And then in a subsequent publication, he wrote a chapter, Why Do Smart People Believe Weird Things? And what you've got there is a situation where if you are actually a very, very intelligent person, you can actually come up with very, very good counter arguments to people who are challenging your views and beliefs and so on. And so, you know, you look at the people who are very, you know, well, for me, theologians, for example, very smart people and can come up with these very, very complicated explanations for their own views that don't make an awful lot of sense to me, but clearly can satisfy themselves and convince a lot of other people as well. But there are, back to your original question, there are ways of actually getting at these unconscious biases, and we can actually study them.
it seems to me that having had a religious upbringing, that the term atheist is a defense term against religion. If one transcends one's religious upbringing, one doesn't need atheism. It seems to me that to be irreligious and to be humanist is a better way of looking at it, rather than atheist, which is reacting against something else. The other thing I'd like to say is that this week hundreds of millions of people are watching football, and at the same time hundreds in India watch cricket. Do you think that sport has really transcended religion?
Nothing to say on football.
Nothing to say on football, apparently.
One thing I could say about what Stephen said beforehand about why people perhaps believe something that might not hold together with the rest of their world views. It might have something more to do with relevance than actual, if there's any truth to it. Think about the thou shalt not kill example again. At the time, very many people would have thought, yes, very good idea, it's a good belief not to kill. But then you have to look at the amount of people who went straight from that, a lot of Moses' followers, to massacre very many other people. So you can hold these two conflicting views. And I suppose another example of it would be, did anyone see the debate between Ken Ham and Bill Nye? Yeah? We were talking about lots of other religious people will point to other religious people to justify holding whatever kind of belief that they have. That's exactly what Ken Ham was doing. Look at ex-scientist, he is a geneticist that believes in creation theory, things like that, and yet these people, having gone to the Creation Museum, seeing dinosaurs with saddles on, because, well, of course we rode these, didn't we? They then fill up on fossil fuels to go home, so you see there's an incompatibility between these two beliefs that actually people hold quite readily in their mind together.
I think your point about sport and and lots of other kinds of activities, I think there are certain elements there that kind of reflect what may be part of being religious. I mean, that whole sense of community thing, I think, is actually quite important. I think that's why events like this are quite nice for people like us, that you feel you're generally amongst like-minded people. And that's why Skeptics in the Pub has taken off, and there are about, 50 branches up and down the country now. So, I mean, and you obviously get that in the context of sport. Even people who are not necessarily particularly into football will make an exception for the World Cup and get a bit excited before England get knocked out. Yeah, but at least for that one moment, there's a lot of us that are all kind of thinking, come on, England. And yeah, there is something in that. I mean, with respect to whether or not I think the labels that people use, they use for a whole variety of different reasons. I mean, I used to always rather pretentiously say when I was a teenager that intellectually I was an agnostic, but spiritually I was an atheist, but just to prove that, I wasn't saying I could prove there was no God, but I strongly doubted it, But, I mean, skeptics have arguments about the difference between skeptic with a C and skeptic with a K. It gets down to that level of nitty-grittiness, And people will take on a label and identify with a particular group for a whole range of different reasons, some of which are probably more intellectually defensible than others.
Yeah, so I want to go back to that distinction between rationalism and irrationalism. I'm wondering if it's really at all useful to keep on thinking in that way, because I was reminded of something when Jonathan put a slide up on which there is Boye's name and Atran's name and Barrett's name. Now Boye is an atheist, Atran's a bit of an agnostic, and Justin Barrett's a Christian. And so all of them are using their System 1 thinking and their System 2 thinking and do the same type of research and come to have completely different faith lives or religious lives. So, and they're all very smart people, and they all do very good research. So they're all using what they think of as their rationality to investigate the world around us, and they're driven by the same sort of unconscious beliefs that we all have. But like, where does it still useful to keep on calling one of them irrational and the other one rational?
I don't see a reason to call one of them rational and another one irrational. It's in that we're all as human beings united by having irrational biases, and we all use our rational thinking, as you say. The reason why some would want to label them that way, and I think a lot of folks here today might want to do that, is that we want to use rationality in terms of an argumentative structure of the reasons behind their beliefs, right? So if you say there are no good rational arguments for theism, then you might want to label the theist in that trinity to be having irrational beliefs. And people want to have that argument. And in philosophy, that's a big debate in philosophy of religion as to what extent is it okay or is it proper to label theistic beliefs as irrational. That's Alvin Plantinga and those folks want to make arguments over what's the rational status of theism is. Are they justified, or should they be labeled irrational or not? Just like we can't prove that other people have minds. We're solipsistic in the sense that we never have direct access to another's conscious experience. Even though we can never show that with evidence, we still kind of believe that other people have minds and experiences. And for that group of philosophers, they say, well, that's a basic belief that you're allowed, and we won't call you irrational for holding that belief. And in the same way, we take belief in God as basic, and therefore you shouldn't call us irrational, right? But I think that that's the word rational and irrational there get used normatively, rather than descriptively. If we're describing the cognitive systems of those thinkers, it makes no sense to say one's rational and another's irrational. It's only if you're saying you're evaluating the belief system as a whole based on a particular notion of what rationality entails that you would find that difference. Does that answer your question?
Is it even right to call system 1 irrational and system 2 rational? Because system 1 has actually a lot of evolutionary rationality in it, and system 2 can be grossly misused, as we've heard already, to rationalize our system 1 biases rather than to try and overcome them. So is that even valid to apply those labels to?
That's a great point. So there's a big debate in philosophy of cognitive science about that precise question of, we had a traditional notion of rationality and we could put it in the dictionary and say that's what it meant. In light of all these new findings, do we really want to just say all of us are irrational and I'll go cry about it? Or should we then redefine what it is to be rational in light of, say, evolution, right? And say that if something had a general evolutionary benefit, then that's rational to hold, But then you get into all sorts of tricky things, like we might have these system 1 biases towards ethnocentrism. And then if you start saying, well then, evolution designed us and that's perfectly rational to have those beliefs, then some people would want to reject that as a way to go about living your life.
I think if I could just add something to that. I mean, I wouldn't think in terms of system 1 is irrational, system 2 is rational. I do think, however, that it's probably the case that for rational thinking as generally understood and in kind of normative terms, you would have to rely on system 2 thinking. So to that very limited extent, you can say that system 2 is more associated with rationality, but system 2, as you rightly say, can be just as irrational as system 1. And system 1 often, I mean, this is the thing, I've really got into a lot of this from my interest in paranormal beliefs, but it applies to religious beliefs as well, I think. We tend to focus, psychologists tend to focus on those situations where you can show that there is an irrational bias. But what we shouldn't forget is that in evolutionary terms, system 1 serves us. It's always me, isn't it? System 1 serves us very, very well. And that's why we have those biases. That's why they've not evolved out. Because in general terms, in the evolutionary timescale, they have served us well. They usually deliver the right answers.
I'm going to disagree slightly.
Oh no!
Let's find out if I'm disagreeing. I mean, it seems to me that just because a lot of often very well educated, sometimes pretty scientifically literate people disagree, and you'll have a large group of people over here saying, we believe this, and another group over here saying, we believe that. In that situation, it's not necessarily a mistake to say that one group is being rational and the other irrational, to say one group is thinking in an irrational way and the other is not, because I would certainly say that about young Earth creationists, of which there are millions, many college-educated, smart people. They believe the entire universe is 6,000 years old. I wouldn't just call that irrational, I'd call it bullshit. I mean, I would go that far. And it seems to me that the patterns of thought that they're exhibiting are highly irrational, but of course they can't see that from within the bubble of belief looking out. It's my thinking that's distorted and twisted. It's my irrationality that blinds me, or sin, perhaps, that blinds me to the truth of what it is that they believe. So the mere fact that there is this kind of disagreement shouldn't lead us to be shy, I think, entirely shy about applying terms like irrational. It seems to me that it is very often entirely appropriate. And in fact, I do think that Alvin Plantinga is irrational, and that what he believes is irrational, as a matter of fact. And I'm not shy about saying that. Having said that, he probably thinks the same about me, which is fair enough. We'll have to figure out which of us is correct. But I don't think we should shy away from using the term on the grounds that it's somehow politically incorrect to call other people irrational. I think we should, if you think they're irrational, say it. All right? Don't bite your tongue.
Yeah, so logic tests for consistency of belief, right? So it depends on your premises. You can make an argument that's consistent, starting from premises that are not that strong, that might be frivolous. Okay, so you can say that something is a frivolous belief, system, but it can be logical. Okay, so both theists and atheists can make logical arguments, but their premises are different, right? Is that what you're saying? I mean, when you say irrational, I'm not sure I understand. Do you mean illogical? Because you can make a perfect theist argument, from certain premises.
From false premises or unsubstantiated premises, yes, of course, yeah. But that's not to say that they are always logical. No, very often they reason in illogical ways. But then so do atheists. It's not that we're all immune. I mean, it's not, atheists have run bad arguments too. Well, I'll stop there.
There's a good example. There's a very good example of a classic argument. You can use a deductive argument. So it would follow that everything that exists has a cause. You can't have an infinite regressive cause. Therefore, the first cause could have been an uncaused cause. Well, that's fine. That's possibly sound and a valid argument from a deductive point of view. But then you have to be a believer to make that last jump to say and insert fantasy here. And to me, that would be an illogical move. So there's a distinction between correct logic and just an illogical jump or an irrational jump that you could make, but many of us don't.
Just to add to that, there was an article, I think a couple of years ago now, where a number of Pakistani doctors in the US were creationists at home, but evolutionists at work. So it didn't get even messier because they got beliefs ascribed to the two different modes of thought, depending on the context entirely. My question is mostly for Chris, but whoever wants to jump in is just fine. I was really interested about the central versus peripheral possession thing. I'd not come across that before. And I was just curious, I mean, we've often heard religion referred to as failed science or fossilized philosophy, that sort of thing. And it seems to me that a peripheral possession, someone who has a fit or something like that, would be described in the terms of religious belief as it happens at the time, and then maybe someone who is in a position of power could suffer from Capgras delusion and explain away the possession of the other individual based on the pre-existing notion that possession exists. And so there is sort of an explanatory power being used, and so there are the vestiges of scientific thought there. They just didn't have experimentation and so on and so forth. And unfortunately, because written language was just sort of coming to the fore at the time, it became sort of literally carved in stone and wasn't put up to peer review. So are we kind of looking at a snapshot of scientific belief that just unfortunately happened to happen at a time when the snapshot was carved in stone rather than written on paper and passed around and then and so on and so forth? Is that kind of where we go with the central versus peripheral idea, that it happens peripherally and then someone experiences it centrally, and because it sort of climbs up the power structure, it becomes entrenched as a belief?
I think that the distinction that was being made there by Lewis between central and peripheral possession was really in terms of the kind of actors involved, if you like. You know, if it was central possession, then it was somebody who was a recognized authority within the community. It would be some kind of major deity that would possess them, and the possession display would reinforce all the accepted values, whereas the peripheral possession would be the low social order people, the ones who were being oppressed, had very miserable lives, didn't have the opportunity to express their views, and so by taking on the possessed role, they could express those views, they could let off steam, they could maybe make demands that they wouldn't normally be able to make, etc., etc. And I suppose that, I mean, in terms of the degree to which the actors involved actually, you know, are not just faking it, if you like, you know, they're not just putting it on, then that's going to a slightly different issue. And I think, again, a lot of the theorizing around hypnosis, for example, is extremely relevant here, because it's a very, very similar phenomenon, obviously. And within that debate, then the argument would be that you get the full range, basically. You'll get the full range even with kind of just stage hypnosis, let alone anything else, where some of the people who are involved when you go to see a stage hypnotist are actually quite knowingly just putting the whole thing on. They don't feel for 1 minute that they're in any special altered state of consciousness, but there'll be other people there who maybe half believe it and some of whom really do believe it. And those people do have a particular type of personality and cognitive profile. They tend to be people who are very imaginative. You know, the more you can imagine yourself into the role, the realer it will feel. And for some people, they may be so good at doing that they can actually convince themselves that they really are from Venus, or that they really are possessed by the spirit of a dragon, you know, and so I think it's using the kind of central peripheral in a slightly different way, but I mean they're both interested in related issues, absolutely.
Thank you, everybody. I've enjoyed these a lot, and I'm not exactly sure if this is a question or a clarification or something, but hopefully I can sort it out as I go. Stephen, I agreed with you completely. I think that we shouldn't be afraid of saying something is irrational insofar, I think, as we shouldn't be afraid of disagreeing with something. You know, we don't have to completely agree with what everybody else thinks.
I think we do. Sorry.
I agree. But I think, Jonathan, you were getting at something which I really liked, and or this is maybe just my interpretation of it, that there are lots of stories we can tell from the collection of observations and facts we have about the world, and any one of those stories will have an aporia or several aporia within it. Greg, you identified the cosmological argument and the fact that maybe even with the scientific explanation of the world, we still don't know where it all came from. So I think that if we can recognize that and recognize that any belief system fails to explain some things, no one is perfect, then we can recognize that when we say something else is irrational, we're not talking from a position of perfection. We know we're not, and that allows us to sympathize with other points of view much better. If atheism, for example, mystifies religious belief and makes it seem to be completely groundless in a way that it considers itself not to be, it's quite alienating. So the sense of irrational is just a sense of like, this is not my preferred way of looking at it, but I understand that it is possible to look at it that way, in the sense that you're choosing that story instead of this one. There's a way of sympathizing a little bit more if we understand that all of our worldviews are imperfect in some way.
I mean, I think one important factor that we've not touched on very much is we're at the moment mostly talking about kind of, if you like, trying to logically think out, you know, what's the best view of the way the universe is, etc. So it's all very kind of unemotional, or at least, you know, we're concentrating on that side of things. Now, a lot of the reason for people holding the beliefs they do in religion is because of very profound personal experiences. experiences that they themselves, you know, let's take the standard examples, near-death experiences, other kinds of transcendental experiences that they themselves would say they can't put into words. They just defy description, they just defy logic, but that is their cornerstone. It was such a profound experience for them that then they're struggling with how to fit that in and make sense of it, and they believe that they've experienced something that goes far deeper than any kind of superficial human logic or rationality. Now, we may take a different position on that, and I certainly would, but you can see there that the role of those profound experiences also has to be taken into account. And as with lots of these phenomena, there isn't a one-size-fits-all explanation. You know, for some people, it may be they may hold the beliefs they have because of their personal experience. For some, it will be because they had a particular upbringing and they were exposed to particular ideas, and they, as John was saying, base their beliefs on, do people actually live up to what they're saying, and a whole range of other factors. And so it's when, I mean, I think that what we do now recognize is that we all have these biases that make certain kinds of beliefs quite appealing and readily believable because of the ways that our brains have evolved. And then on top of that, if you get these profound personal experiences that even if you don't have them yourself, you hear about and you read about that reinforce those belief systems, then I'm not too surprised that lots of people do buy into the ideas of religion.
It was very interesting, one of the things you said about all of our worldviews being intrinsically flawed anyway and having some sympathy for each other because of that. We take again the cosmological argument. You've got a pretty sound reasoning process there, and then you brought up the Big Bang. So where did it all come from? If it all came from nothing, might it be intrinsically flawed that our concept of nothing is wrong? I think it's Lawrence Krauss that actually says that nothing could be something. It's limited by our vocab. We think of nothing as the absence of something. It could be that actually it's all made up of everything else.
I thought you made a very good point, actually. I liked your point. But I think I mean, very often, if you're in a debate with somebody that does believe in God, they will, if they find themselves on the back foot, they'll say, yeah, but you explain it then. You explain why the universe exists. And I think the right answer to that, for most of us, will be, I don't know. I mean, I don't know the answer to that question, but that is, and then they think that, then they've leveled the playing field at the very least, because they have an explanation and I don't. So, there's one up for them then. But of course, it doesn't follow that you can't quite reasonably rule out their explanation, even if you don't know what the correct explanation is. So I think the right thing to do is to show that humility and say, I don't know the answer to the question. It's a really tricky question. I've got some ideas, but frankly, I'm not at all confident that I know the answer to the question. Having said that, I'm pretty confident that your answer's wrong because, I mean, in the same way that, Sherlock Holmes may be having a bad day, he doesn't know who did it, but he knows the butler didn't because the butler was in the room with him at the time, okay? You can still rule out certain candidates. We can all rule out the hypothesis that this universe was created by a supremely powerful and supremely evil deity. Look out the window. You can see it's not that kind of universe. Good evidence against that God, even whilst we don't know what the correct explanation is for the existence of the universe. So I think the humility point is good, yeah.
Hi, my question was for Jonathan, but I'd be interested to see what you all think. When looking at more fanatical religions or cults such as Scientology, would you expect the sort of caregiver influence to be higher on the children, or would you expect it to be a sort of balanced playing field?
So do I have your question right, that you're asking about cults or religious groups like Scientology or more fanatical groups, and saying would Cred's exposure be higher?
Yes.
I think probably yes for that, just in the sense of the examples that I know of commonly get closed off and then demand high levels of commitment from members that's demonstrated in a variety of rules about diet or dress or who you can and cannot interact with. And all of those rule following things that, cost you. You can't talk to this person because they're not, they might have useful information for you, but they're not they don't believe the same things we do, so therefore you can't talk to them. That's a credibility enhancing display for the idea that you're actually willing to follow through with these rules. And the more rules that they have that have a chance to be followed, you're going to have more and more Cred's exposure. So kids growing up in those environments might have that level quite high. Now, there might be other reasons why they might eventually leave. It's not that creds is determinative, but I think creds exposure, would be high in those religions. I think that's right.
To go back to Professor French, who was talking about speaking in tongues, I can't remember the term used. People exhibit a similar kind of thing if they've taken a lot of hallucinogenic drugs, a lot of ecstasy or so on. You were speaking there about it being a learnt behaviour. With the people who you believe it to be a learnt behaviour, I was just wondering, are the brain patterns, is it the same thing causing that? They almost convince themselves so much that it has the same result as somebody who is doing it unconsciously through drugs or alcohol or whatever, or are they simply, as you know, just doing it because they want to believe that they're doing it?
But I mean, basically, I think what the brain activity studies show is that the parts of the brain that are normally about control, etc., are kind of dampened down. Basically, there are lots of different techniques in ritual type situations for producing that kind of dissociation. So in some circumstances it might be rhythmical chanting or beating of drums, etc. It might be engaging in practices that involve intense concentration. It might be taking changing drugs or whatever. But the end result is that people go into this kind of dissociated trance state, and then afterwards, very often, will report that they can't remember anything or much or anything about the actual experience itself. And obviously that can be a very a very kind of profound experience for people. The point that I think Spanos is making there when he talks about it being a learned behaviour is that the specific form that it takes is determined by the context. So if in your religious group speaking in tongues is associated with having convulsions and writhing around on the floor, then that's the behaviour that is learnt and that is demonstrated. Whereas in a different religious community where it's rather more like what I showed you in the video clip there, then that's the behaviour that will be exhibited. So there's even then, obviously, there is some, I won't say it's kind of a degree of conscious control, but there is you are still following a set of implicit rules. It's not just any kind of random behaviour, or as we see in the case of generalised seizures, where those people have no control whatsoever over what's happening. It's purely down to the kind of electrical firestorm that's sweeping across the cortex, and in particular the motor cortex. Does that answer the question? I hope it does.
Yeah, I was just, and has anything been done to measure whether it is the same activity in the brain between when it's brought on by chanting or religious settings, whatever, or whether when it's brought on by hallucinogenic drugs?
I think that's one of those situations where we can actually show that we can say, I don't know. Because I just don't think there's not been that much research on it, is the short answer. So we don't know. You could speculate.
Thank you.
One very last quick question, I think. Blakely? Thanks.
Thank you very much for all three of your lectures. Professor French, you mentioned the neurological activity of epilepsy and the neurological activity of glossolalia, and you noted that it had been localized to one particular area. And I'm sure you yourself have read about the work that Green has done in localizing utilitarian judgments to the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Has anybody on the panel seen any other evidence about this phenomenon of being able to localize these often quite abstract processes or states?
As far as I know, there's not. I mean, I think Sam Harris did some neuroscience stuff on distinguishing belief from other types of states, but in terms of like a God spot in the brain, so people that worked with epilepsy, like Robert Persinger and all that, would talked about something happening in the temporal lobe, but it's certainly the case that lots and lots of people believe in God and don't have those experiences, and even people that say, I felt God's presence and all this kind of stuff don't have these types of experiences. So what would be in common amongst all of those people that you could fine-tune in a particular area of the brain? I haven't seen anything yet that leads me to that type of conclusion.
I did actually take a look at the neurotheology, as they tend to refer to it, with respect to what might be happening in the brain when people pray. And I mean, some of the early studies find a particular pattern of activity, but then subsequent studies find different patterns of activity. Maybe not too surprising, because when you actually stop and think, well, you know, what do we mean by prayer? There are so many different types of prayer. There are so many different kinds of activities that people engage in when they pray. I would say my overall impression of that literature, without having gone into it in any great depth, is that the kind of findings are all over the place, really. And certainly this notion of a God spot within the brain doesn't really seem to hold up, even though you will find people using that kind of language.
Great, we have to stop now, I'm afraid. For those of you that have been praying, it would end. I'm going to grant your prayer. Thank you so much, Professor Chris French, Glen Carrigan, Professor Jonathan Lanman,